right, so welcome to this amazing interview series, which is Getting Through the Holidays After Loss. And we're kicking this off with Paul Denniston. With any of you that have watched the film, have gotten to see me working with Paul and his grief yoga practices and how they were so instrumental for me and have helped thousands of people all over the world. And so I'm really excited to join and jump into this interview. But before I do, let me give you a little bit of background on Paul. Paul Denniston is the founder of Grief Yoga, which uses yoga, movement, breath, and sound to release pain and suffering and connect to love. His intention with Grief Yoga is to combine many forms of yoga in order to help heal grief. And he's got a ton of online courses that deal with all kinds of loss and teaches this practice to counselors, psychologists, and healthcare professionals in his training platform. So to learn more about Paul or to go learn more about Grief Yoga, go to www.griefyoga.com. And ready to jump into this call, Paul. I'm really excited to chat with you, 6 years later after we did the interview. And so just welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I think where we can start off first is anybody that's watching this is probably, or a lot have probably watched the film already. And I know in my journey in the film, I was trying to think through grief initially. Like I was trying to understand it, think through it. And then when I got to doing somatics or more body based, I remember there was a phrase you said of, you got to heal it to feel it. And it
Mhm.
really stuck out with me. And maybe we could just start off with people that may not have
You have to feel it to heal it.
feel it to heal it.
Yes.
And so maybe you could start off here, like how does grief get stuck in the body for those that are not really understanding it or maybe still trying to think their way through it? What would be your perspective around that?
Well, I want to just say for those who, to feel grief is a very it's a challenging thing. And I personally spent a majority of my life running away from it or avoiding it or trying to think my way out of it. But I found is that I started to see how it started to show up in my body. And I think that the first time I started was about really anxiety. I could feel the anxiety, the tension in my shoulders. I would clench my teeth at night because I was grinding my teeth, and I think that um, it started to show up from an anxiety place. And I went into a yoga class um, early on because I was trying to seek some sort of peace. And then I just started to see how much I was holding on to it in my body. And I think that the reason that we hold on to it in our body is that because it doesn't get expressed, whether that be unresolved anger, unresolved sadness, or shame. And I do think the heart of yoga is about compassion. And so when we can, from a compassionate space, start to see where we suppress these emotions within our body and start to begin to feel them and move them through, I do think that it can create powerful transformation.
Mm. Yeah, I know it's been some of the most profound work for me is getting into the body. And one thing I
Hmm.
love about your work is you make it fun. Like you really have a way. Now, granted, some of them are anger or uncomfortable, but I do find we were doing the practices, it started to feel better. I could access emotion. And so
Yes.
I guess one question I have that people may be a little confused around is like, it seems so simple, right? It's like, oh, I do this practice and then I'm feeling emotion all of a sudden. So I guess I'm curious from your perspective, when they're doing these practices, how does it allow them to access their body versus when they're not doing any forms of practice to get into the grief? How does that keep them stuck or disconnected from their body?
Well, I think with the work that I'm doing, it's very intentional about grief, but I think that many people use exercise as a form of mental health and well-being, whether it's I'm going to go for a brisk walk here, or for some people who's got a lot of anger issues, maybe doing a kickboxing class. So I do think that what's happening within from the embodied standpoint is that there is a release that's starting to happen there. And I think that when we're coming from a place I think that because we judge specific emotions also, that we tend to suppress them. And we judge them because maybe they feel they're inappropriate or they're too vulnerable to come out. So what's happening in it is a place of release that I think is very important in the healing process.
Yeah, and one thing I loved about your work was not only is it can be released in, let's say, the anger or release in forgiveness or feeling some of the sadness, but also laughter. And I thought that was one of the things that really shifted my whole frame of thinking around grief because I was so used to like, I got to get into the grief, almost like I got to do the work. And I know when we did that exercise and the laughing exercises, it almost built this new awareness of like, oh, like when I've suppressed my grief, I've also suppressed my joy. And so if I
Yes.
can learn to feel my grief and my anger and my sadness, I can also learn to feel joy and happiness and aliveness. And so I'm just curious, how did you discover that piece? How did that lead you into the joy as well?
Well, I think that when I first started to create grief yoga, and I created grief yoga dealing with the different losses that I had experienced, whether it my sister who had passed away or my stepson who had passed away. I was dealing with a lot of grief also because I had decades of addiction and substance abuse. Um, and so I felt like it was, look, I used perhaps like drugs or sex or alcohol as a way of maybe finding play and pleasure, but then it kind of turned and shifted when the addiction started to really take hold. So one of the things that I do think is important is I do think that pain demands expression. And so once that starts to happen, when we start to begin to release it, then what can happen is it can create the space for either love and laughter. And the reason why I incorporate sometimes laughter exercises, I'm trained in many different forms of yoga, whether it be hatha or vinyasa, kundalini, laughter yoga, restorative yoga, and I blend them all together in some ways for a grief yoga experience. But the reason why I'm incorporating laughter exercises with some of these flowing heart opening things is because it's a fine line between laughter and tears. And sometimes people who can start to laugh, it can actually give a space for grief bursts or love bursts. There's this scientific observation how the body can't tell if laughter is real or fake. And yet, when we laugh, endorphins are being released from the brain. It's helping us within our oxygen, and it allows the free flow of emotions to move through. And so sometimes even these laughter exercises can help us to tap into places we're feeling a little uncomfortable. But the laughter is specifically a tool that can also begin to help us to open the heart and to remember with more love.
Mm, I love that. I love that. Especially during the holidays. I think the holidays
It's
can
hard
be,
to laugh sometimes too. I mean, we want to feel joyful, but when we're dealing with grief during the holidays, it can be really hard to access that.
yeah, really difficult. I know I struggled with that for a long time. I was almost just
Mhm.
like this neutral space in life and kind of
Yeah.
lost the joy and aliveness. And I think even one of your practices really got me like, oh, I can have full hearted laughs. And I was like, I'm not really doing this very often. So even practices around that to help release something that can be stuck. I found it really, really helpful for me. For those that are going into the holidays and they're already kind of in the muck, I know for me sometimes from like Thanksgiving, my brother died December 6th, or his birthday is December 6th. He died the 28th. So I've known it kind of can be a little heavy, even though it's been 15 years. So anybody else that's either just gone through a recent loss, it could even be, an old loss similar to mine that they notice a little bit of heaviness or denseness, or it could be losses not tied to a loved one. Like we just had an election. Some people are excited, some people are in deep grief. So whatever somebody may be grieving right now, what would you say to them that are listening? It could either be a practice, it could be a suggestion, it could be whatever coming from your now frame of knowledge. What either helps you get through the holidays, or what do you think would support them?
I think it's taking it one moment at a time. I think that really just kind of meeting where you're at and is there a way that you can just find a sense of acceptance with what you're going through right now. And acceptance doesn't mean we have to like it. But acceptance just means that, okay, this is what's happening for me today. I'm feeling like I'm having a hard time getting out of bed today, or I'm feeling like really agitated and irritated and hurt, to just kind of to meet what's showing up in this space today. And is there a way that you can allow whatever that is to have a little bit of an expression? Maybe it's through journaling. Maybe, it is through some sort of physical activity. Um, it could be also just a moment of stillness and breath, and maybe I'm just gonna sit with what I'm going through today. Maybe I need to go and do something and have some sort of a physical activity. I think the first thing is to really just acknowledge whatever it is that you're feeling right now. And I also think that finding a sense of connection is really important. It can be support from others. That connection can be a little bit like, I'm going to just be kind to myself. I really am having a hard day today. And sometimes when I'm having a hard day, I can be really cruel to myself. My mind can be really challenging. So can I just find a little bit more of a softness and gentleness within that? Um, Connection can happen through spirit. Maybe I'm going to offer and say a little prayer today, or maybe I'm going to go to a 12-step meeting, or I'm going to go to a church, or is there a way that you can connect to spirit? Maybe it's I'm going to take a walk in nature and I'm going to speak to my loved one. Um, where can you find connection at this time?
Mm, mm. So powerful. I'm curious. I know sometimes I can get almost frozen, like in a freeze response, and
Hmm.
it's hard to move. Any suggestions on what you've done? And like, if somebody's listening, going, "This all sounds amazing, but I'm stuck, or I can't move, or I was able to watch this, interview, but I'm having a really tough time getting into movement or action because I feel almost a little stuck or heavy or lethargic." Anything for like a free state for anybody that gets stuck in a free state?
Yeah, I think that to find a little bit of a sense of like safety,
Mm,
and I think that if it's hard to move. I think that it's just kind of like I think to kind of accept that space that you're in that way. And I think pattern changes are also really helpful. Like, you know what? I feel like I need to do something a little. I need to have a little shift here, and maybe it's like if I'm having a hard time moving, I'm just going to set some dedicated time to do something that's a pattern change. I'm actually going to go out and do something like a walk or something. Or let's say if someone who's like really intensely within grief and they're having a hard time coming out of that, maybe a pattern changes. Hey, you know what? I'm just going to go and watch something light on the TV and that can make me laugh, right? Or maybe a pattern changes, you know what? I feel like there's some anger issues that need to get addressed here. I'm going to take a pillow and I'm going to pound on this pillow for a little bit to have a sense of relief. So I think a little bit is like an acceptance of what is, but what's a pattern change that can kind of help to transform and shift it a little bit. I think that sometimes that can help.
mm. Yeah, really, really helpful. Like an acknowledgement, this is here. I'm
Yes.
accepting this is here. And now that it is here, how can I do just something to get into movement, some sort of a pattern change, some part of a repatterning, which means I know if I get up and can at least go for a walk, even if it's cold, your mind goes somewhere else. Now you're thinking about something else. You're getting into some movement. And I love
Hmm.
how they could even pick up a pillow sitting down and just have a little moment of,
Little drumming moment if you want to, and if you're starting to feel like there's some anger, it's you can start to begin to move that through. I do definitely within like grief yoga practices use empowering techniques that can start to help us to channel and move pain through. I definitely have techniques that I begin to offer within that space that do that. I mean, here, you want me to just kind of share one quick
yeah,
technique here?
that'd be
Like,
great.
let's say you're like, I'm having a hard time moving forward today. Okay, I'm gonna move my chair back here. This is called breath of courage. It gives you a little bit of an energy boost. Okay, I'm gonna move this back and I'm gonna move this camera down. Okay, so it's a very easy and simple technique, but my hands are at my sides. I'm going to inhale through the nose, lift the arms up, and exhale, bring my elbows to the ribs with a yeah, and inhale, lift it up, then exhale, elbows to the ribs. Oh, good. Let me just share with you just a little bit of like what's happening within that space. So a lot of the times when we're feeling a little bit like lethargic or I'm having a hard time moving forward, perhaps our breath becomes a little bit shallow. So this is a place where we're starting to deepen the breath and we're using sound, which is a lot of what the practice is about, to begin to move suppressed emotions through. But this also can be a very powerful technique to help us to move through it. It's just breath of courage. There you go. A lot of the times, what I start to do from a safe place then is once you start to feel a little bit of strength and empowered, is just begin to say, okay, some of the struggle and this pain that you're holding on to, let's begin to move it through using some other techniques that begin to shift it, to release it.
Yeah, one of the things I guess I've learned just through felt experience after doing your work, I noticed there was a commonality of a lot of them are using sound like huh, huh, and I noticed
Mm-hmm.
a lot of them have like a movement of my diaphragm, and
Mm-hmm.
I noticed it seems like over time that the grief almost gets stuck in the diaphragm. Is that one thing that
Mm-hmm.
like or what they call the center column? And it seems like all of your work revolves around using breath and diaphragmic movement and sound to
Yes.
move. Is that what you're essentially doing? Is you're getting movement in the diaphragm, which allows
Yes,
the
we're
body to
creating a
move?
sense of release, and we're using it through the voice. But a lot of the time, sometimes it can get really, a lot of people also gets really stuck right up here within the throat, within grief. It's hard to talk about. And so we're using the sound in order to open up the throat space, okay? But in order for them to feel a sense of empowerment, yes, it is coming right here from the diaphragm. And why is it coming from the diaphragm? Because the deeper we can breathe and the sound coming from there, the more that it is coming from an empowered place. But when we breathe deeply, we feel deeply. And so sometimes when people who are having a lot of deep grief, they'll even say, it's hard to breathe. And so encouraging the breath to become deeper and then encouraging the breath and the sound to come from a deeper place, it takes what's deeply suppressed and it begins to channel it and move it through. Because once we start to do that, powerful transformations can begin to shift and to happen.
Yeah, it's all starting to land. So let's connect the dots a little bit. Let's say somebody is at home, you're having trouble moving. If you can find access and just go on griefyoga.com to some of Paul's courses, what's great is a lot of them you can be just sitting in a chair, right? I know at least that's how I experienced them with you. We were just sitting in a chair.
We were totally sitting in a chair. Yeah, one of the things that I was really, look, I'm certified with many different forms of yoga, but one of the most important things about this practice was that I wanted to make it for everybody and a practice that wasn't Cirque du Soleil yoga. I'm not trying to put someone in a pretzel, but it was more about using intentional movements, using movement, breath, and sound to take whatever the struggle and the pain is and begin to shift it, to release it. And then what's on the other side. And a lot of the time, what's on the other side can be a place where we witness the grief. But the grief, since it is a reflection of the love, once you can start to do then flowing meditations that can begin to open up the chest and open up the heart space, it does create what I would call a ritual of loss and love.
Mm. Well, and I know I've attended your classes as well. So there's different types of movements. Some that are more because somebody may be listening, going, "Oh, I'm thinking of going to a yoga class where my body's contorted and I'm doing all these things and I'm struggling with thinking about it." And just to normalize, what I love so much about Paul's work is you can literally be sitting in a chair. He could walk you through warm up exercises, which are or not warm up, but his actual practices, which feels like it warms up the center column for me. Like my experience of it is like oh, I'm getting into breath and sound. I'm getting into movement. You're walking me through some where I'm pulling things up or opening the chest up or getting into anger, even from my own chair. If something feels a little aggressive to hit a pillow, you even have practices where you're punching forward. And so there's just, he's got so many that are so simple that get you into emotion. And so anybody that's listening right now, the holidays can be so tough. And if we're collapsed or stuck or feeling heavy, it can just kind of collapse us into a darker hole or lead to the numbing behaviors when then we can shame ourselves. I know that's been some of my patterns in the past or addictions. And so being able to say, okay, just like Paul said, hey, let me accept I'm in this funk, or I'm in this heaviness, or I'm in this grief. And if you could even just be playing videos to go, okay, let me give this some expression, where I just play the video and I walk through the exercise, and then notice how you feel after. Because you may get a little bit of grief, you may get a little bit of anger, you may get a little bit of movement, which Paul said before changes the state. And I noticed for me, after being so constricted in the head, the hardest part was it just felt uncomfortable, like almost getting out of control a little bit. I don't know why it was, but I almost wanted to, felt safe, almost stuck in this frozen state, almost felt safe, and getting into some of the practices. I mean, even when we were shooting for the film and he had me get in anger, I had some resistance come up. I'm like, I don't want to hit this pillow, so and and then I did, and I felt better. And I
Right.
think anybody watching watched me feel better through that experience. So I just want to encourage you, if you're listening and you're in it and you're feeling a little closed off or stuck or numb or frozen or just in heavy grief, it can just be a doorway to starting to get some movement, sound, aliveness. And then you could have even a daily practice that starts very simple. And do you have programs that some are from a chair and then some get into more expansive forms of practice as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. I offer it's everything that I kind of do shows variations that you can do from a chair and from a yoga mat. But also, I was just thinking about something that's very gentle if for people who are a little kind of like disassociated or having a hard time kind of moving forward. It can be very simple about getting into the body. Like take, for instance, I'm just going to demonstrate a technique here, and it's called the Sufi grind. But really, what's happening here is with breath, you're kind of creating a little movement within the spine here. And a lot of the times, our spine can get very tight and rigid within grief and loss. So one of the ways that you can start to do that, just even from your chair, I'm going to lower this down a little bit here, and then just start to circle around with the torso here as you breathe. And what you're doing within this space is you're kind of creating a little bit of a deepening of the breath, but you're gently moving the spine here too. And then you can start to kind of create circles in the other way. And as you kind of play with this, you can also then play with sighs and sounds if you wanted to start to move whatever through. Is just take a deep inhale and just sigh. Ah. And so what that is doing is slowly helping you to kind of get into the body, deepening the breath, moving the spine, and starting to open up the throat space too.
Yeah, I really love this because, and the reason I started with freeze was because it seems like that's where I was seeing people similar to where I go to sometimes, which is like, this all sounds great, but I can't get out of my chair.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
Sure.
so the other person that is very active or deals with your grief very much action oriented or movement based, I'm sure you'll be
Mm-hmm.
able to jump right in and go really deep with some of these. But even
Mm-hmm.
for the person that struggles with getting out of the chair or feeling anything, there can be really gentle practices to start to give some expression to the grief. And so when we talk about expression, maybe go a little bit back to that initial conversation of like the grief gets stuck in the body. What happens when we start to give it expression?
Well, I think different things can come up for people. I think that it definitely is a clue on where we judge specific emotions. I mean, you talked a little bit about there was a little bit of like judgment of like, oh my gosh, am I really going to be pounding on a pillow here? And then it helps us to see how we judge specific emotions. It's like anger is, bad, or some people even judge laughter or feel like it's inappropriate. So I think that the main thing is it's interesting to see what gets suppressed. For some people, I may suppress joy. For some people, it's anger. For some people, it's anxiety. And so you gotta you gotta feel it to heal it. And so when we suppress it, it doesn't create that opening. And so what we're just doing within this space is we're just seeing where we suppress and judge specific emotions, and we use movement, breath, and sound to begin to offer a little bit of a release because we hold on to so much of it, you know, and a majority of the time we're also just really stuck up in our head. So there is Nietzsche talks about there's more wisdom in your body than in the deepest philosophy. And so it's really about kind of like having many different tools from an embodied standpoint that can begin to take and release what we hold on to, what we suppress.
Yeah, that feels really um, potent. I know that's been part of my journey is going from in the head almost unconsciously disconnecting from feeling
Right.
and then starting to move into the body to feel it. I look very different as even the 10-year journey goes on. You see me look very different, and I think that's because of starting to feel and soften into the body and how I came back to life again. Um,
A
Curious what
wise man once told me on the playa, the furthest distance I would ever go was from my head to my heart. And it was a really big aha moment of like, yeah, I am kind of stuck a lot of the times in my head. And maybe I do need to, spend a little more time here in the heart, or to get curious about, where in the body needs a little attention and needs a little expression in that way.
Hmm. Yeah, and I'm curious as we're talking through this, when we say we got to feel it to heal it, I know there's different perspectives around, can you heal grief? What does healing look like? Maybe I'd like to go a little deeper into your perspective around it
Yeah.
because different viewpoints, different perspectives. Curious about to learn more about yours.
For me, I think that grief is a companion that will be with me for my life because I choose to love. And so I have found that if I can befriend this grief and sorrow, and instead of running away from it and instead of numbing it, if I can be with it and befriend it, I find that it shares with me what's important in my life.
Hmm.
And a lot of the times the grief is starting to really show up when I feel like this thing that's important in my life, I'm starting to lose it, or I have lost it. And so I think you got to just feel it. I think that the way to be with grief is to grieve. And I also think that you have to spend dedicated time with it. I don't feel like it needs to just be with you for 24 hours a day. But if you don't feel it, it does stay with you. It does weigh heavy on you. And so I'm a big believer of like, let's have concentrated time where we honor it. And what can happen is there can be a shifting here. I mean, I certainly, your film is beautiful, and the way that you hold retreats is very much like it's a ritual that you're kind of creating within that space. So I believe that a grief, within a ritual space can be a really important one. And that can be literally like, I'm going to spend some time honoring my grief by, it could be going for a walk and speaking to my sister who's passed. The grief could be literally like, I'm going to go to a yoga class and I might just kind of lay down on the ground for a majority of the time. The grief could look like I've got some anger that needs to be released, and using some embodied perspectives within that way will do it. So I think that it's interesting. I spent so much of my life not wanting to be with it. And that I have learned that once I start to be with it, then I can also befriend laughter and laughter and joy. That, oh, they're kind of connected in that way too. So it's just kind of, all of this human experience that we're going through has all of these different shades of emotions. And when we judge specifically different emotions, it just gets a little harder. So it's just to really notice where these emotions are just information, and for us to just kind of like feel it and experience it. Um, and it's a lifelong process. And some days it's harder than others. And I it's like, don't be cruel to yourself if you're like, there's if you're not doing it right. I think that the thing is just meet yourself where you're at and say, how can I kind of lean into what I'm experiencing and going through at this point? But I will say this, it's just like the body is an powerful tool for it. So using the body to support that, I think is a really important. I believe that grief is an embodied space. And and if you allow your body to kind of like go there, it's like you're moving through it.
Hmm. Yeah, I really love that. I also believe grief is our love. And it's almost like when we don't feel the grief, we're not feeling our love. And so if
Mm,
we can find simple, easy ways to access it, which is I love a lot of your work, is what became very simple to access through movement, sound, breath, then you can access your love again. And it seems like that's at least how I experience it. The joy coming back to life, or the color coming back to life.
mm,
I was listening to an interview from RYX around grief, and he talked about, the musician, and he talked about it's like you're in the ocean, you're going down, and you don't know where the down is, and it's heavy and it's dense, and you don't want to go further, but you keep falling, and you're wondering when you're going to, hit the bottom, and you keep resisting it, resisting it, resisting it, and then there's this point where you just almost surrender to falling, not knowing when you're going to hit. And it's almost in the surrender that you notice your feet kind of touch the ground and almost become comfortable in this heavy, dense, dark unknown. And then at some point you start to drift back up again, almost when you've become comfortable in that
mm,
heaviness. And then as
mhm,
you drift back up, you start to notice life again, and you're seeing the color of the fish, and the colors of life again come back to life again. But you now have this comfortability with the dense darkness of that grief. And
mm,
I related so deeply because it was like, oh, mine was a 15-year journey. In the last 2 years, I've just been like seeing color again.
mm,
And so I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to put the film out, was like, hey, no matter where you're at in your journey, if you're year one, if this just happened recently, if you're a decade later or 15 years later, there may still be grief. And learning to get really patient, at least has been my journey, of a lot of compassion, a lot of patience, allows it a little easier to, one, be there with me, and then two, be there with others. And so that leads to, you've been doing this work a long time, Paul, and you've also been through a lot of your own grief. I'm curious, how's that experience for you, continually being in the grief space and continually being with people that are grieving? How's that experience been for you? Do you have to continually do additional practices to lean into that grief space, or have you learned practices to move through your own process? You're not taking that on. Just curious from that perspective.
Well, when I first started really doing this work, I was a bit of an empath, and I think that serves a purpose in some ways, but it can be overwhelming too. And I think that when you're working with people with grief and loss, um, as an empath, I think that what happened is that it became debilitating after a while. And so what I had to do was I actually had to notice that, and I had to go to a place of like, I think I need to lean more towards compassion. Because compassion, I'm present with them, and I witness the suffering, and I'm still as a little bit of an, as an empath, I'm still kind of like taking it in, but it's also like there's an awareness of like, look, I can put my feet in your shoes to kind of like, what is that like? But those are your shoes, and I can consciously like take my feet out of the shoes and just come back to myself in that way. So I think that um, that certainly does help. I think that what I saw you do with your film is a little bit of what I also find helpful within grief and loss, in which it's to create something meaningful after the loss. I did that with the work that I do. The book that I wrote is dedicated to my sister, who I lost when I teach sometimes this practice to groups who are dealing with addiction. I might say this one is for my stepson. Um, I think that if we can create something meaningful from the loss, I do think that it helps. And the creating something meaningful could also be, I'm just going to sit with this person who's really struggling right now. And I'm just going to listen to what they have to say. And I'm just going to be there. Or I'm going to, if my loved one, their favorite thing was a specific type of cookie, I'm going to, maybe share this type of a cookie with someone else in remembrance of them. So I don't know. I do think that um, if we can create something from loss, I think there's a lot of beauty to that.
Mm, that's beautiful. Like it makes it sacred. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's one of the things that my family and I learned to do together, which kept us together. Because I think a lot of families, I've read some stats that 50% break up, or it breaks the family unit up based on how they deal with grief. If somebody wants to do what my mom did and just leave everything untouched, and somebody wants to get rid of everything really quick and move on. But I think us celebrating him and finding ways to do things in his honor kept us
Mm-hmm.
together through that. Um, for a long time. I think 12 years we ran a Burning Man camp in his honor.
Mm-hmm.
And now it feels like we're finding a new season. It's almost like the season where it's not as heavy anymore and learning to do life again. And so if anybody is listening that maybe it's happened and they're relearning life again, curious what that looks like for you. Like if you've been in a grief coma, I guess it's probably applicable to me too. Like I've been in a grief coma for so long. Now I'm waking up and learning to live life, but almost like my old identity or patterning has been the brother who's been grieving my brother, and now I'm relearning who am I without that. If that makes sense, he's still here, he's still connected to me. But I'm just curious, have you had to go through a similar journey of that, like rebuilding your identity or rebuilding life without that being the central theme? Is that resonating at all? Like
Yeah, I think that well, one of the things that I don't think that grief can be forced or pushed. I think it has to naturally happen on its own, and I think it needs dedicated time. But it makes me think of in the near the end of your film when you and your family decided, let's change the room. Let's take, let's shift the Jeffrey's room and make it a different thing or clear out some of the items and stuff. And I think that's evolution, and I think that that is moving forward. It's something new is being born with it. And I think that when we give ourselves the space to allow the grief to happen, I think that that does happen. I mean, for me, it happened when within the grief yoga experience, there was a part of me that goes, "Oh, wait, I'm missing a sense of like laughter and I'm missing a sense of happiness. Where can I access that? Where can I find that?" And so that literally is what took me into the laughter yoga world. But it gave me that sense of like laughter, but it doesn't mean it's still not a part of the experience. So it's like it's interwoven within the grief experience. So I think that I think that it's just because I believe that love and grief are just connected in that way, and it's my choice to kind of love in this life, then it just kind of there's a blending, I would say, that happens. But it's also, I think it's also like it's a wake-up call to say, hey, I'm still here. What is it that I want to do here? What sparks something inside of me? Is that traveling to someplace? Is that creating something? I'm still here for a reason. So what do I do? What's next? And I think that if you can be in alignment with whatever specific gifts that you have, and then take it and are connecting with others within it, I do think that it creates a sense of purpose. And I do think that finding purpose after loss, I think is really important. And perhaps our purpose changes a little bit after the loss. So it's a question of like, well, I'm still here, so what do I do with this time? You know, be
yeah,
curious about what comes up.
yeah, I really love that. I know for me, my journey initially, the purpose became about learning, and then when I learned, I wanted to share it with others, and it was like my healing process to even help others move their grief. And I think that was part of my healing journey. And then more recently, I've almost been like, I think I'm complete. I think I'm complete with that journey for now, and it's almost moving into more like family systems and wanting people to have healthy relationships and happy relationships still. I guess using some grief work, because now I see it. I'm curious if this shows up for you too. It's like now going so deep into grief, it's almost like I see that as the primary reason for everybody's challenges, like unprocessed, unaddressed grief. I'm like, oh, it's why they have addiction. It's why they struggle in their relationship. It's why they can't make money. It's like I just almost see that where the world is so resistant to grief and loss that I'm like, oh man, it's like it's the biggest challenge. And yet I've noticed the heaviness. That's why I really honor the work you do, Paul. It's really deep, profound work. And most people are running. It's not a sexy industry, even though it's becoming a little bit more well known. Like, I think the trauma informed space has become more a mainstream narrative. And I'm really
Mhm.
hoping the grief becomes a more mainstream narrative. And I see it moving
And
more.
all trauma has grief to it.
All of it, right? That's like so to stand in this and continue to claim a flag in this and do this work when everybody's running and you're going, no, I'm going to do what's actually needed to shift everything for everyone. I just really honor you for standing this, and I want to help more people find your work. I'm a huge advocate for the work you do in the world, and I think it's powerful and beautiful, and it's really helped my journey.
Mm.
And how would people find out more if people are listening and going, I love Paul's work. I want to learn his practices. I want to get more grief yoga. Do you have practices where
Yeah,
they can
check
practice? Is
out
it online?
griefyoga.com. Griefyoga.com. There's a list. You can find free classes that are there if you're interested in like courses that are there. I have, weekly classes that I teach on Zoom. I have trainings if you want to be trained within this. So just check out griefyoga.com. You'll see my book is there too. So that's the place to go to.
Amazing. And just from my perspective, I highly recommend you check it out. Jump in if you're struggling a little bit with loss. Like jump on right now. Jump on, go on griefyoga.com, jump on a class, and just notice if you feel a little bit better, feel a little bit lighter, because these small little movements can really make a big difference in your life. So thank you so much for joining us today, Paul. Really
As a
appreciate
as
your
a
time.
as a man, I just want to thank you for being a model for how men can, embrace their grief and show it. I think that we need that more in our life. And so, thank you, brother, for modeling that and showing that and being vulnerable in that.
Mm,
We need that.
mm. Thank you. Thank you. Fully receive that.
Hmm. And last thing, I think Jeff would be very proud of you.
Mm, mm. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that feels good. It's been my long journey honoring him.
Good.
Didn't make any sense. It was a little crazy and Lunatune how I did it. I just started filming and spending and trying to make it happen and put it together. But I'm just proud to have this in completion because it shows I'm kind of complete with this journey, and that feels really good. So thank you for seeing me, brother. I really appreciate it.
Congratulations. Well done.